Hi, I'm Joseph Crud, and welcome to my storybook. Today, a part two in this book called No Kill Now. This is the part two in this book. Chapter 2, Protest and Prosperity. Throughout its history, North Carolina has been prosperous. In its early years, the region's abundant natural resources made North Carolina an attractive place to settle. Board researchers, the universities, and hard workers residents have helped the state continue to die, but great sacrifice and protest has sometimes been required to bring prosperity and freedom to all. The Ancient People. The Ancient People. During the Pauline Indian period from 10,000 to 800, 10,000 to 800 BCE, Northern hunters and gatherers roaming the area that is now North Carolina. Great glaciers still cover some of the ground, and these ancient people lived by hunting non-insect animals, insect animals, such as the mastodon, which provide them with meat as well as skins for which to make clothing and shelter. The people referred to as the Arcadian Indians came next, sometimes between 700 and 2000 BCE. The gladiators have receded by them, and these people live in a climate that is similar to the one North Carolinians enjoy today. The plants and animals differ from those animals to the parallel Indians with white terror. They'll become they're becoming a plentiful sources of meat, wild fruit, and seeds widening out to the Dali and the egg-shedding Indians. These white these people will normally travel with those seasons in search of food, but they stay for short periods of time along the many riverbanks that still exist in the area. Echolocatus have fine shells of pottery and polished stone tools that they believe were used by this group. Sometimes between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE, a different group of people took up in North Carolina. Residence in North Carolina. This group is known as the woodland people. The woodland people live more civilized, building in villas and leaving behind more special towns, power, and tools. They also left behind signs that they were farmers, growing such plants as sunflowers and mass odor. The plants they raise did not supply all the nutrients they require. However, some of these people continued to hunt animals and to gather wild foods. Members of the Mississippi cultural family living in a region from about 800 CE until the 1500s. During this period, people from the three major language groups made their homes in what is now North Carolina. This means there were three major languages spoke among the native people living in the area when Europeans first arrived. These were the Ingquara language. Its speakers lived mostly on the coastal plain. The Ingquara. Its speakers live on the inland coastal plain and in the western mountains, and similar, its speakers live in the Piedmont area. Today, the Cherokee are an Ingquara speaking tribe. The Spaniards speak and some other language, and the lumpy speech florist language. When Europeans arrive, they find that many of these tribal people grew different crops on their farmlands, with corn being one of the major ones. Beans and squash were also important crops. The Negro people are also said to have introduced tobacco to the Europeans. Hunting continued to provide a social nutrition for the Negro people. American Indian life. In the days before the Europeans first settled into the region, North Carolina was home to about 30 American Indians, Indian groups, including Tuscarora, the Haddles, and the Cherokee. The Tuscarora and the Haddles were among the tribes that lived in a small village near the ocean or along rivers and streams. Villagers, villagers, villagers often built walls on dark discs around their settlements to protect themselves from enemies and predators. They got food by farming, fishing, and hunting with and arrows. Bows and arrows. The Cherokee lived in small villages in the application of mountains in what is now western North Carolina. They cut down trees to build homes and kennels and fasteners, clothing in our animal hides. The Cherokee used tree bark and the roots, leaves, and berries of plants to make medications to treat injuries and disease. Europeans arrived. When the first Europeans arrived in the region, then war became North Carolina. There are approximately 35,000 American Indians living there. This was not a known fact in the internal explorer named Gavani de Venazzo. It sailed along with mid-Atlantic coastline in 1524. He traveled from the area near the Catfield River on the southern shore all the way to the Dalton corner of what is now North Carolina. During the next 50 years, a number of Spanish explorers led the expedition north from Florida into the area of North Carolina. But now Spain set up a clothing there and set for a Spanish outpost at Fort Saint Louis, a Salvador in 1567 to 1568. During the 1580s, what would later become North Carolina's coastline became the site of England's first colonies in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh, who had been granted the land by Queen Elizabeth I, sent two explanations to the area. Little is known about the first statement. It was in Salvador on Wanamore Island in 1585 and quickly fell. Talking to the animals. Telling stories had always been a skilled part of Cherokee life. Here's a tale explaining how the world came to be. Long ago, humans and animals lived together as friends. Each night they all sat around the campfire and told stories. The snakes talked about the things they saw while crawling through caves. The wolves told about life in the valleys and cleanliness. The bears shared their adventures while hunting along the mountain areas, and the human brain talk about making pots and building houses in the village. As the days passed, the people began to spend more time talking about their own lives and less than time in listening to the animals' stories. They never heard anything. I had to say, hasten the snake. All they want to do is hear themselves talk. Ho- Bowling the wolf, hollering the wolf. It's an assault. Roar to bell, roar the bell. Let's lay here and never come back. None of the humans heard what the animals said. They were much too busy talking to one another, and none of them noticed as the animals left the campus and wandering off into the woods. Millions later, a large bear walked into the human's village. Good boy, said a woman walking by. War, said the bear. I can't understand you, said the woman. Let me take you to our sheep. I'm sure he'll understand what you have to say. But neither the sheep nor anyone else in the village could understand the bear. Finally, the bear wandered back into the woods. A few days later, a young man was chosen to go and live with the animals and learn their language. When he returned to the village many years later, he could he could hiss he could he could hiss like a snake, bow like a wolf, howl like a wolf, and roar like a bear. He could also show the animals stories and human words that the other villagers couldn't understand. 2 years later, a second group of shelter. 2 years later, a second group of shelter, led by John White, arrived at Wanama Island. Shortly after their arrival, a baby girl named Regina Della was born. She was the first child born to English-speaking parents in the New World. The new colonists made their homes in a wooden house left behind by the first settlers. They quickly made friends with the American Indians who lived in the area, but the settlers had different surviving off the resources available on the island, on the island. White soon returned to England to get more food and supplies. For most 3 years, war between England and Spain made it impossible for White to return to the colony. When he finally returned to Woman Island in 1959, he discovered that the colony had been abandoned. No trace remained of the settlers he had left behind. The only clue he could find was a single word, Corridor, which was carved in huge letters on a wooden post, and the letters CRO carved on the tree. The Sutton Planet, the Sutton Plantation, the Sutton Plantation. Now until the 1650s, the English settlers finally gained a foothold in the region. During that period, a steady flow of settlers from southeast Virginia moved into the northeast corner of what would become North Carolina. In 1663, King Charles II in England presented the providers of Carolina as a gift to 8 men, called the Lords Prosperity, who had helped him come to power. Now properly stretching all the way from Virginia to the Spanish colony of Florida, and include much of President's Day, North and South Carolina. From the beginning, the Lords Prosperity had promised governing the colony. There are frequent arguments with Virginia over land, and a deal pirate known as Blackbeard steadily attacking supply ships off the coast. But the most serious conflict was with the Tuscarora, the Negro people who lived along north the Nassau River. Chief Hancock of the Tuscarora was angry with the white settlers for building homes and families on his tribus outland. In 1711, the Indians attacked an English statement near present-day New Bar, killing hundreds of people. During the next year, the Europeans and the Texan colony fought one battle after another. After their defeat, the Texan colony fled to New York. In 1729, all but one of the Lord's proprietors sold their land back to the English crown. As a result, North Carolina and South Carolina became crown colonies. North Carolina was governed by the same law in place under the Lord's proprietors, but now it was the British king who appointed the governor, and other colonial officials. Slavery and the Quakes. During the 1740s and 1750s, a group of English settlers known as the Quakers moved from Pennsylvania into the Piedmont region of North Carolina. Much settled near what would become Greensboro. Then in 1753, a German religious group called the Moravians founded the village of Salem. In the following years, raised German settlers from Pennsylvania marches into the area, building as sawmills, tunnels, and small barrels. The Quakers and the Moravians believed that anyone should have the right to worship in any way they pleased. They also believed that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, were equal in the eyes of God. African slaves had first arrived in North Carolina with the earliest European explorers and settlers. As large tobacco and cotton plantations spread up along the southern coast and around Charlotte, more and more slaves were brought into the religion. Slaves worked from the sunrise to sunset each day, clearing the land and planting and picking crops. Vincent, North Carolina in 1747. The Quakers missionary John Waldman was deep in trouble by the condition under which the slaves lived and worked. I saw so many vices and corporations increased by this slave trade and this way of life. He wrote, they appeared to me a dark gloominess hanging over the land. Through his preachings and writing, Workmen convinced many Quaker shelters to free their slaves and speak out against slavery. A new nation, a new state. As the year passed, North Carolinians came to resent being ruled by William Traylor, a governor they had not elected. In western North Carolina, a group calling themselves the Regulation began to openly protest British rule on the colony. In 1775, people in western North Carolina expressed their desire to be free from England. The movement for independence soon spread all across the colony. On July 15, 1775, North Carolina's last colonial governor, Joshua Barton, returned to England on a British warship after he was chased from the colony by a group of angry preachers. 8 years later, At the end of the Revolutionary War, North Carolina found itself part of the new nation. On November 21st, 1789, North Carolina representatives signed and ratified the new U.S. Constitution and thus became the, the 12th the 12th of the original 13 states. In 1828, from North Carolina, resident Andrew Jackson was elected U.S. President, one of the long nation's most celebrated military leaders. Jackson had become a national hero during the War of 1812. He was also known for his campaign against the Creek and Seminole Indians. While president, he drove the never. People fought farther and farther west. Later, in 1838, President Martin Van Buren ordered U.S. troops to remove the Cherokee from their homes in western North Carolina, fulfilling Jackson's plan to clear the area of the American Indians. The Cherokee was forced to relocate, marching on foot to the reservation in Oklahoma, suffering from cold, disease, and starvation. Many Cherokee died. Many Cherokee died during the 1,000-mile journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. But hundreds of Cherokee involved captain by hiding in the forest and later escaping to the North Carolina mountains, where that descendant that continues to live. The Civil War. By the 1850s, slavery has already begun to disappear in North Carolina. There were very few slaves in the mountains or along the coast. In the Piedmont, where slavery was more common, the Quakers and the Moravians had convinced many of their neighborhoods to free their slaves. On the affair between the rebel during the American Revolution of North Carolina, born General Robert Howe was put in the command of the Southern Continental Forces. His appointment was met with great disapproval in South Carolina. Howe was opposed due in part to his bitter rivalry with South Carolina's General Christopher Gadsden, spelled differently in the Sun. The situation got so out of hand that the two actually fought a duel, with the bloodiness calming things down between them. That was a song for this king. They met, and in the usual way, with hat in hand salute, which was, no doubt, to the shoe how they like gentlemen disposed course. And then they both made this honest declaration that they came there by honorly, but not by inclination. That if they fought, just not because of recognize spot of passion, but only to obey the laws, or constant an oath of fashion. The person then, before their eyes, were fairly employment and loaded, each, west, and so did G likewise. The constant was explored, but as they now had gone so far in such a bloody business, for action straight they both prepared with much forgiveness. Quoth H to G, so pleased to follow. Quoth G, no pray begin. So, and truly, one must needs arrive. The temple they were in, so We'll fire both at once, he said, and so they both presented. No answer was returning by Lee, but silence, so consumer. They pausing around these these gallant foes, by turns politely, grimly, turning out the many coins and paws. Each made a break beginning. He missed his mark, but not his arm. The shot was direct. It saved them both from hurt and shame. It saved them both for hurt and shame. What more could be is but accepted. Then Lee, to show to him meat no arm, but hated jaws and jingles. His pistol fell across his arm, from eight almost at angels. Eight now was called upon by Lee to fire another shot, so he smiled and after this, quoth he, no truly I cannot. So such honor they dare both display. They highly were commending it, and thus, in short, this gallant fairly wrapped merchandise, and it was ended. No fresh dispute remained supposed, whether by them be started. For now the cheats, no longer foes, shook hands, and so they parted. So they parted. In the closest twist of fate, the Civil War contributed to the long-term development of North Carolina's economy. Throughout the war soldiers were given the sugar tobacco along with food. Many of these men had never used tobacco before, but once they had tried it, they continued to buy it after the war with all the new tobacco barrels. Tobacco farming and production became the serious business in North Carolina. In 1874, Washington Duke and his sons built their first tobacco factory in Durham. The following year, R.J. Wells founded his own tobacco company in Winston-Salem. In the decades that followed, North Carolina will become one of the world's leading tobacco producers. After gaining their freedom, most former slaves decided to remain in the state. Many continued to work on the small farms and plantations of their former masters. Others took jobs working on tobacco farms or in tobacco factories. But while jobs were plentiful for the free slaves, life was hard, and their freedom was slavery limited. During the 1870s, laws known as the Black Codes were passed by the all-white state legislations. These laws prevented African Americans from holding office or owning property. African Americans in North Carolina will continue to suffer under these laws for almost 100 years. Moving forward, during the 20th century, North Carolina had to overcome hardship and conflict to improve the quality of life in that state. In 1901, Governor Charles B. Alcott forming North Carolina's first public school system. At the time, most people in the state worked on farms. First in flight. In 1900, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, named Overlord and Wilbur White, began trying to build the world's first military flying machine to get their rain invaders off the ground. The Wright brothers wanted to find a location with the best wind conditions for flying after the large stretch. They chose a sandy, isolated called Kitty Hawk in northeastern North Carolina. In 1900 and 1901. They're testing their early gallery designs there, both with and without pilot on board. In 1902, the brothers successfully tested an important galleon design, sailing 620 feet over the sandy dunes. The following year, they returned to Kitty Hawk. This time, the galleon spotted a front-end propeller that was powered by a four-cylinder 12 horsepower engine. On December 17th, one boy tried unsuccessfully to get the new machine off the ground at the Kill Devil Hills, a few miles from Kitty Hawk. A few minutes later, O'Rara gave the machine a second try. It was a success. The whole trip lasted only 12 seconds, and the primary airplane traveled only 120 feet before it came back to the ground. But the Wright brothers had proved once and for all that humans could use monetary machines to fly through the air. The age of air travel had officially begun. And at most school age, children spend almost 9 months of the year working along their parents, having tobacco, corn, or cotton. Only one out of the three children attend school at all. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of new schools were built and dozens of new teachers were hired throughout the state. North Carolina slowly began to transform itself from a largely intolerant state to a leader in education, and likely in the Southeast. During the 1920s, North Carolina began a preliminary wall building program. The hundreds of dirt walls that crisscrossed the state were gradually prepared. The new program earned North Carolina the nickname the God Wall State. Thanks to this program, even today the state has the second largest system of state-maintained roads in the nation. In the late 1920s, the national economy collapsed in what is known as the Great Depression. People were left without jobs or money as businesses shut down and foreign prices dropped. North Carolina suffering along with the rest of the nation. This was an important time of growth for the state, though, as the federal government stepped in with constitutional projects to bring people back to work. Along the coast dozens of North Carolinas were importing illegally the canals that formed the interregional waterway. Meanwhile, workers in western North Carolina built two important roads through the mountains, began in the early 1930s. The Blue Ridge Parkway provides millions of travelers with breathtaking views of the North Carolina mountains each year. And the Scientist Mountain Pathways at the Platinum Trail, which was completed in 1933, helped make the Smoking and Blue Ridge Mountains among the most popular vacation areas in the nation. The Civil Rights Movement. For many years, North Carolina was prosperity did not intend to honor its census. Almost 100 years after the Civil War, African Americans did still. Almost 100 years after the Civil War, African Americans still did not enjoy the same rights and freedoms as their white neighbors. In 1964, African American college students in Greensboro staged a protest that would change life in North Carolina forever. At the time, most white-owned restaurants in the state refused to serve blacks. The teenagers decided to challenge the practice. On February 1st, they sat down at the lunch counter of the Woolworth store in downtown Greensboro and asked to see mentors, but the Woolworth employees refused. The lawman, however, refused to leave their seats. During the days that followed, more and more people joined the group, including several white stewards from the area. This form of protest, calling a sit-in, soon spread to other restaurants and stores. A few days later, with television cameras rolling, lone people were finally served their meals. After that, white-owned businesses throughout the state began to open their doors to black customers. I was tired of just talking about equal rights. Franklin McCain, one of the stewards, remember many years later, this is my country. No one's going to deny me that opportunity. I ain't going to be thrilled. I was going to be a full participator of every aspect of this community. Similar demonstrations throughout the rest of the South helped to bring attention to the mistreatment and discrimination against African Americans, thus promoting the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The ongoing struggle for racial equality in North Carolina has not always been peaceful. In 1971, African American students were protesting segregation or the separation of races in Wilmington schools. After the grocery store was burned down, 10 young people were arrested. Many people believe that the teenagers who became known as the Wilmington Ten were innocent and had been named as suspects only because of their involvement in the protest. All 10 were convicted, however, and received an prison sentence of at least 20 years. But in 1936, the three main witnesses against them confessed that they had lied. 4 years later, in the Wilmington Ten were released from prison. In the early 1970s, the once solely Democratic state started voting more and more with the Republican Party. In 1973, James E. Holshouser, more and more Holshouser Jr. became the first Republican to be elected governor in 8 years. After the 1972 election of Jesse Helms to the U.S. Senate, North Carolina sent their first Republican senator to Washington, D.C. Since 1903, Helms will go on to spread his conversational influence over the state until he retired in 2003. Marching into the 21st century. By 2009, life in North Carolina was changing in many ways. The state, along with the rest of the country, was suffering from a severe economic downturn. There were mass layoffs in almost every industry, leaving many North Carolinians unemployed. The state government was forced to make budget cuts and enormous deposits. Things were also changed on the political front. In 2008, North Carolinians had voted for the Democrat Barack Obama for the U.S. president for the first time in decades. And for the first time in its history, North Carolina was being run by a female governor. In January 2009, Beverly Porter moved into the executive mission after being sworn in as governor. Producing has been the first female legislative governor. before she won 50% of the vote in a tight race for governor. Purdue was not the only woman in the state government. She joined five other women: Secretary of State Ellen Marshall, Treasurer Janet Caldwell, Antonella Beth Wood, Superintendent of Public Instruction Jean Atkinson, and Labor Commissioner Charlie Berry. As some things changed, others stayed the same, despite getting hit with a few big hurricanes in the early years of the 21st century and a big snowstorm in 2009. The North Carolinas can still set Francis weather for the greater part of the year each year. Dope tobacco sales was sliding. North Carolina's countryside was still dotting it with their family and the persecutor tobacco bonds that people had grown used to seeing. Trips to the states shoreline continued to bring relief from the heart, sticking day or August. But most of all, no matter what changes people might have to face, they still love living in this beautiful and deserted state. That's the end of this chapter 2, or in this book called that I have just read as right now. I have just read chapter 2, Protest and Prosperity, in this book. Now tomorrow, in this book called North Carolina, we're going to be reading chapter 3, in this book called There is Senate and War, the People of North Carolina. That's the end of this part 2 of this book called North Carolina. Part 3 starts tomorrow. Until then, I'm Judge Crudup'S.